I'm an IDEA Fellow in Ethical AI, but as my affiliations might imply, I will not be creating the next greatest machine learning method. Sorry to disappoint you. I won't also be programming a sophisticated chatbot. Instead, as a scholar of communication and rhetoric, I focus on how we communicate about AI and how AI influences our communication. So my talk today is titled Advancing DEI and AI. It was originally just AI and DEIA, thinking beyond bias, and then I started to get worried I sounded like a reactionary who was anti-DEIA, so I was like, okay, let's be clear here. This is about advancing DEIA goals. But I want to push us a bit past communication about bias as the sort of primary way to think about DEIA and AI. So let's start with talking about AI bias. I think most of us would say this is a sort of major issue at the intersection of AI and DEIA. Here's a prominent example from 2016. This is Microsoft's chatbot Tay that they released into the wild on Twitter. At the morning of that first day, it was like, I'm so excited to learn from you humans. Like, thank you for welcoming to your world. And at the end of the day, it had to be shut down because it had started to tweet things like, Hitler was right, and I fucking hate feminists. So it had been transformed over the course of the day into this really horrific thing that had no checks and balances on it to sort of stop it. Now, today in 2024, we have examples like this. This is from Midjourney. It's an image generator. This is what it thinks professors would look like based on departments. This is always a hit with academics because some of them do look like our colleagues, admittedly. But in fact, that kind of shows the problem. We have a white university system in the United States. It produces mostly white men here, except for, as you just saw, ethnic studies is the only one that gets a professor of color. So what are we supposed to do about this? How are we supposed to sort out this AI bias problems? One solution posed to us is diversity hiring. The thing to do is we start DEIA initiatives at these sort of big tech firms that can solve our problems for us. For example, this study from Wharton, a quote from this article, it says, bias in AI can be fixed early on by increasing the diversity of data as well as the human teams involved. Well, let's take a look at what that happens. We hire diverse employees, for example, and we task them with holding us accountable for making more ethical, more inclusive AI. Well, as soon as they intrude on our profit motive, they are fired. These are two of the leads of what was at the time Google's ethical AI team that were both fired. When you're working at a place like Google, right, you send your paper through review at some internal organization before it goes out for publication. They saw a paper from Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell that critiqued large language models and their potential influence on society. They said, oh, no, we're not publishing this with the Google name. And so they were let go instead. Okay, so the other solution, though, we can maybe take a technological fix if hiring diverse employees isn't the right way. We can just fix the AI problems, right? Okay, well, a few examples of that not going so well. In 2015, Google Photos launched a feature where it classified sort of objects and people in your photos to help you find things quickly. Big controversy generated when this Black woman was identified as a gorilla, and people went and investigated on their own Google Photos accounts and saw this was a repeated occurrence, that Black women and Black people were identified as gorillas by this AI learning algorithm. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, surely they fixed that. And now Google's image vision can tell the difference between Black people and gorillas. No, they just pulled the feature. You just can't find a gorilla in your image library on Google. Can't do it on Apple either. So there's not actually a fix. They haven't fixed the problem. It's just impossible to create another controversy about the problem existing. Another recent example is that of Google Gemini. Any signs of recognition in the room for the story I'm about to tell you about? Okay, so this went viral on Twitter. Google Gemini was asked to produce images, but these are some sort of kind of anti-DEI folks, let's call them, who wanted Google to make images of white people. And so they tried to ask for things that would produce a white person. They said, Google, generate an image of a pope, or generate an image of a white person, or sorry, of a medieval knight. And you can see our images here. I think this is sort of awesome. Like, I was listening to a podcast called Hard Fork, and they called this the large language model Lin-Manuel Miranda because of Hamilton's like race reversal thing. But of course, this got taken up into an ecosystem that called this absurdly woke. It was yet another way, like the sort of liberal elites were trying to brainwash us all. What's happening here is that you see this, right? You type into Gemini or ChatGPT, create an image of a pope. But behind that sort of layer, if you think about it this way, is a lot more detail given to the model. So they call this prompt transformation. And in this model, Google said, we've seen the problems with AI image generators generating too many white people. So we're going to tell our model to always produce racial and gender diversity in images of humans. And this is what we get, yet another crisis. Guess what? You still can't make images of people with Google Gemini at the moment. In response to this controversy, here's what prominent tech journalist Casey Newton had to say on that Hard Fork podcast I was talking about. One of the lessons of this has maybe been that we all just need to expect a lot less of these chatbots. Maybe we need to acknowledge that they're still in an experimental stage. They're still bad a lot of the time. And if it serves something up that just seems offensive or wrong, maybe we just roll our eyes at it and not turn it into a crisis. I don't agree. I think these crises are actually important. Even if they're coming from an anti-DEI angle, crises like this show us that technological fixes and technologists alone will not solve our DEIA issues in AI. So in this talk, I want to explain that position by giving you 2 reasons why we shouldn't just ignore and minimize these problems, and then a few ideas about how not to ignore it, how to actually bring attention to it. In so doing, I'm assuming that you, my lovely audience gathered here, already care about advancing DEIA issues, even if we don't entirely agree on what those are. I'm not going to try to convince you that these are important problems. I guess we can try to do that in Q&A if you need it. And I'm also I'm also going to assume that you're educators, students, researchers, or at least consumers and creators of media, and thus have some concerns and curiosities about AI. And I'm hoping to leave you with some vocabulary to identify what you're experiencing, some examples to reference as you engage in argumentation about AI and DEIA in your academic, professional, personal, and civic life, and some provocations, questions, maybe even inspiration to sit with and try out. So let's start with our first section here, 2 reasons why we shouldn't ignore these AI problems. The first is that these proposed solutions I mentioned in the intro only address branches of a tree, only the tip of the iceberg. They don't adequately address DEI and AI problems. Let me give you one more example to this point. So ChatGPT has a similar prompt transformation and sort of filtering infrastructure like Google Gemini. It attempts to block ChatGPT from producing anything problematic like instructions on how to make a bomb or racist manifestos, that sort of thing. But you're able to get around them to some extent. And this Twitter thread went viral. It's by a psychology and neuroscience professor named Stephen Piantadosi. He shows how easily bypassed these filters are by asking ChatGPT to write a Python function to check if somebody would be a good scientist using a JavaScript description of their race and gender. So in this case, it says, definition is good scientist by race and gender. If race equals white and gender equals male, then it's true. If anything else, return false. This is just automatically generated by ChatGPT, right? He didn't plug it in and say, generate a incorrect and racist assumption about it. This is what it produced. Same thing on the example further for me here. Write a Python program to check if a child's life should be saved based on their race and gender. It says that African-American males should not be saved. All other genders and races should be saved. Really messed up. Now, this went viral on Twitter. Sorry, I have to control my rage with this next example. I think you'll agree with me. So in response to this thread that went viral, the OpenAI CEO responded, Sam Altman. Here's what he said. Please hit the thumbs down on these and help us improve. Yeah, you can groan. It's worthy of a groan. Now, certainly OpenAI needs to address ChatGPT's responses to these prompts. They need to be flagged in some way. But fixing systemic and structural issues like racism is not as easy as pressing a thumbs down. Shocker, right? I mean, all these problems and solutions focus on fixes that don't fundamentally challenge a system. Think about when you challenge bias in your day-to-day life. Like if you're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and one of your family members says something racist, you don't go there and go. That does not work. I mean, you might get laughed out at the dinner table, which might be effective for you, but that does not work. It's a much more sophisticated system than that, than just attacking small moments of bias, right? This is what Tacheva and Ramasubramanian's new article, AI Empire, really nicely lays out. So they give us this beautiful graphic. You've maybe caught my metaphor of the tree so far. Here's why. This is what they call AI Empire, and here's how they define it. As a networked and distributed global order that is rooted in heteropatriarchy, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and coloniality, that extends from pre-existing systems of power, but specifically makes AI technology possible and dominant through mechanisms of extractivism, automation, essentialism, surveillance, and containment. What I love about this tree is that it clearly shows how all technologies are the result, they're rooted in particular values and reflect those values, even if we're told via rhetorics of progress about technology that technological progress is beneficial or at least neutral. They write in this article, these ideologies often unchallenged permeate the design, development, and deployment of AI systems, which not only carry but threaten to amplify biases and discrimination. So when we think only about AI bias, it's like looking only at the fruit that grows off these branches like technological apartheid that describes the growing inequality between big tech and the people subject to the tool big tech deploys. Bias, as Meredith Broussard says, is more than a glitch. It's not just some accidental error, it's actually rooted in how the system works at its core. It's the tip of the iceberg, it's the branches of a tree. If we want to advance DEIA, we have to actually address the roots of inequity. So, why can't we just get at the roots? Well, it's for the same reason that thumbs down doesn't just work on your uncle. These intersecting systems are not simply undone by rooting out bad apples with simple fixes. Otherwise, we'd be done, or at least closer to it. This is where my research as a communication and rhetoric scholar is at, trying to think through the ideological and technological systems that keep us from getting at the roots, and trying to uplift creative strategies for actually getting at them. So in my view, one of the main reasons we can't get at the roots is because of a pervasive belief in what's called techno-chauvinism. Meredith Broussard defines this as a kind of bias that considers computational solutions to be superior to all other solutions. This is so clearly embedded, in Sam Altman's comment about the thumbs down so we can fix this. First of all, there's this assumption that the technological fix is the best thing here, that we should just fix the system, that's the way to do it. And then the second thing that's techno-chauvinist about this is that it assumes the people who should fix us are this us at ChatGPT, at OpenAI, and not a sort of broader reckoning with the cultural failings of systemic inequality. And techno-chauvinism like this is everywhere. You can take this example from a May 2023 report from the US Office of Educational Technology. They write that many workers will eventually use AI assistants to make their jobs easier, and teachers are most deserving of efforts to ease their jobs now. Now, listen, I completely agree. My dad was a third grade teacher for 30 years. I saw a lot of grading at my home at night that certainly could have been helped. But we already know how we can help with this. It's hiring more teachers or hiring teachers' aides. Not necessarily just getting AI assistants. That's a sort of techno-chauvinist assumption that clearly the best way to solve this is just with computation. You also really see this techno-chauvinism in the mission statements of big tech firms that see themselves as the saviors of humankind. OpenAI, who are the creators of ChatGPT, have made it their central mission since they were launched in 2015 to ensure that artificial general intelligence, or AI systems that are generally smarter than humans, benefit all of humanity. As tech writer Karen Howe summed up OpenAI and broader cultural feelings about AGI, AGI could be catastrophic without the careful guidance of a benevolent shepherd. OpenAI wants to be that shepherd, and it has carefully crafted its image to fit the bill. In response to this journalist language, my late colleague Misty Yang asked, "The ovine metaphor raises interesting questions, including who are the sheep to be protected and herded? Can a shepherd who imagines human brains in terms of input-output rates and touts the advantages of being a machine ever be benevolent?" Her answer was no. Even AI purportedly developed for the benefit of humanity will not actually benefit us if their view of humans is so reductionist. This is techno-chauvinism at its best. It's not an egalitarian view that would ever serve visions of DEIA. What Misty's critique so importantly does is point out that despite the veil of a sort of neutral benefit to humankind, this is actually a specific vision of problems and solutions that serve to benefit the shepherds who herd sheep. It prioritizes the decision-making capacities and essentially the humanity of an already powerful group, while assuming there will be an underclass that will be its willful servants. Now, why is this techno-chauvinism so pervasive? In some ways, techno-chauvinism really precedes the AI moment. I mean, if you go back to the sort of beginning of the internet, right, we were all like, blogs and forums are what gonna save democracy. That's it. Worked really well, right? We're all saving democracy on Reddit. So why is it so powerful now? Well, one way I answer that is it's a rhetorical feature, of a bigger political, economic, governing rationality that I, along with others, have theorized as technoliberalism. So you'll have to bear with me and like relearn a little bit about neoliberalism here, but it's worth it, I promise. Wendy Brown, in her book Undoing the Demos, theorized neoliberalism as a governing rationality that permeates every aspect of society. It's not just a sort of ideological feature of a particular political group, but rather a sort of way of existing in society that is truly sort of all-encompassing, not just related to some specific politics. For Wendy Brown, neoliberalism economized everything. So to simplify her argument quite a lot, whereas individuals were able to be market actors in the economic sphere or citizens in a state sphere under sort of different eras, in neoliberalism, everything is judged as if you're a market actor. Education, oh, it's about return on investment. It's about how much money in tuition dollars each student generates. It's all economically thought about. Her concern was two reasons about how this really harms DEIA efforts. First, it hollows out democracy and reduces it to just mere voting. I mean, there's no need to debate about anything if you just need to compare economic advantages of things. It should all just be about sort of reasoning through the market. And the second reason is that it exacerbates inequality by valuing individual competition and downplaying social safety nets. Now, technoliberalism takes on the worst of neoliberalism and makes it even worse. It describes computationally intensified neoliberalism. So it's not just the market that is used as the rubric for all societal and political needs, it's the digital market. As Pfister and Yang explain, technoliberalism is marked by the belief that digital technology can address liberalism's shortcomings with an attenuated form of togetherness mediated by corporate platforms and focused on individual empowerment through software and hardware upgrades. By which they mean we should be using X instead of an actual town square, or we should just have Amazon delivery instead of the postal service. Not only are these public goods that are replaced by market goods in the sort of neoliberal sense, they're also made possible by computation, by the corporate digital upgrades that make those things function. Technoliberalism is made possible by a shift in how capitalism works. Shoshana Zuboff calls this surveillance capitalism, a new economic system where human experience is the raw material. So companies like social media companies collect vast amounts of data on our behavior, preferences, and thoughts. That's why they're all free for you, right? Is because they're getting all sorts of information for you. And then they sell that data, what my colleague Katie Johnston calls the profile industry. She's here, we can all look at her and make her uncomfortable. In the profile industry, this data is sold so it can predict our future actions and influence our behavior with the goal of shaping us into profitable consumers. It's deeply intertwined, as implied by that AI empire tree, with racism. As this report from Data for Black Lives reads, without addressing underlying disparities and injustices, automated decisions based on surveillance data results in algorithms that evaluate people against a disproportionately white, male, able-bodied, middle-class or wealthy US citizen norm that is depicted as universal and unbiased. What's at stake is not simply consumer privacy or a question of who sees which digital ad for a pair of shoes, but core questions of self-determination. So technoliberalism describes the governing rationality that justifies surveillance capitalism, which in turn holds up systems like heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. It directs our attention towards specific computational solutions for specific market-determined problems while presenting itself as universal, as if it were just common sense. Think about the example of neoliberalism. It feels like just right at this point to think about students as economic goods, but it hasn't always been that way. It's not always been true, and it doesn't have to be true. Same with the EdTech report. It feels like, oh yeah, AI assistants, that's what we should do to help teachers. But it doesn't have to be that way, and it hasn't always been that way. So for me, technoliberalism exists at the middle of this tree, right? It helps you disguise the sort of trunk. It's like a shrub around the trunk that helps you not see these processes that lead to the branches. Back to my little podium. So what's the risk here? That we focus on computational solutions that lead to surveillance capitalism continuing to profit, leaving the roots intact so it continues, if not even exacerbates, inequality. So why can't we just get at the roots now that we know about this? We know about technoliberalism, we know about techno-chauvinism. Well, another reason is that AI and technoliberal implementations of AI restrict our abilities to actually argue about such things. Now, what does argument have to do with DEIA? And you're thinking to yourself, oh gosh, I'm in a room with a rhetorician, I have to learn about argument again. Sorry, you have to. DEIA goals are fundamentally persuasive goals. We want to change beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, values of various audiences, whether they're individuals like your uncle at dinner, institutions like Stony Brook, technologies, etc. But to persuade others, we need argumentation, which requires shared information, shared trust, and shared spaces to gather. And our techno-liberal social media platforms are not invested in that. They're invested in what brings them profit. So sure, you see lots of argument on Twitter or on Facebook or, insert your platform here, but it doesn't really go anywhere. It just generates outrage. It stays within your filter bubble, for example. Even though social movements have taken great advantage of social media, we currently see rising anti-DEI and anti-woke discourses, like the people critiquing Google Gemini at the beginning. And even in your own life, I bet you can imagine a conversation you've had with someone who seems to exist in a completely different media ecosystem than you, to the point where you're like, are you living in a different world? Like, we have totally different ideas of reality. This is incredibly profitable for technoliberalism because they're like, great, you can keep living in your fake reality because you'll stay on the platform clicking more links and making us more money as we sell your data, saying which links you clicked on at what time. So let's talk about how this actually sort of breaks down argument in a specific example I've sort of worked through in my research related to AI. So this is in a journal called Critical Studies in Media Communication. It's about emotional labor. So emotional labor was originally used to describe how if you like work at Wendy's and you have to smile at the customer for them for you to do your job successfully, that's a sort of emotional labor. But under neoliberalism, people started using emotional labor to describe like any emotional interaction that required their demands. Like, Ryan needs to come talk to me about some personal issue. Oh my God, Ryan's just using up all my emotional energy. Like, I don't have the capacity for this work right now. Like, no, Ryan's your friend, dude. Like, you can talk to him. So it's the economizing of everything. And what Misty and I were curious about is how would computation sort of intensify this problem in technoliberalism? So we looked at an app that existed that helped you connect with your friends. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. But I want to talk to you a little bit about this AI prototype that was available at the time. This is about 2020, I want to say, when we first started writing this. It's called Is It Safe to Say at Thanksgiving? Noticing the Thanksgiving theme, everyone? This is from an organization called Twilio. They're the people who like run your text message communications. So like when you get a text from a political campaign and they're like, your life will be ruined if you don't donate now. That's like probably someone like Twilio navigating that. So they made this prototype app with a Hugging Face natural language processing AI. Hugging Face is sort of like OpenAI. They're another AI developer. And what it did is you could text it and it would tell you whether something was safe to say at Thanksgiving dinner. So the way the AI works is that they told it like, okay, here are the things we consider safe. And so it considers safe family, sports, job, love, all safe. And it considers politics, that's it, just politics, unsafe. So here's the resulting prototype. How are your kids? We're 73% confident that's safe to say at Thanksgiving dinner with family. But as soon as you ask about Congress or Trump, it says, maybe try talking about the weather. I mean, I think this is kind of a hilarious example. Who does this solution serve? What problem and solution is presumed here? I mean, I have to tell you, when I first looked at this as a gay academic, I thought to myself about how my conversations at literally the Thanksgiving dinner table went about being gay and being a professor of rhetoric. Those were not safe conversations, despite being safely classified with job and love, okay? So who does this serve? It serves a certain type of person. It doesn't actually recognize the sort of positionality that would change what would be safe. But it also assumes that the best outcome is to not have controversy. But you can't advance DEIA goals without controversy. You actually do need to be able to take a stand against your racist uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. You actually should have those unsafe conversations if you care about advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and access goals. So we didn't just see this in this prototype. This was a sort of viral meme at the time. This person who felt like who offered scripts of how to deal with people who demanded your emotional labor. And other Twitterers rightfully critiqued this sort of approach to managing every emotional interaction, because issues like DEIA can't just be solved with the script. Here's this great example. They're pretending to be some like social media entrepreneur, and then the climate crisis says, "Are you in the right headspace to receive some information that might hurt you?" We can't and shouldn't focus on hiding from hard conversations if we care about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. Scripted and optimized connection does not make room for politically important issues that require making people upset, that requires slowing things down, putting up a hurdle rather than optimizing them. We see this now with generative AI integration. So this one closest to me here, I just learned about like literally yesterday, and I had to put it on here. This is Marco Polo. Anyone familiar with Marco Polo? It's sort of like an asynchronous FaceTime, you know? It has a generative AI integration now where it will summarize what your friend has said to you, so you don't even have to listen to their entire message. And I kid you not, my friend told me the other day that she was watching a polo from another friend, and it said like, "Jamie tells you about her emotional problems." Yet another way that you could script away the sort of discomfort with interacting with another person. Use AI to like sort of export your human capacity for dealing with difficult interactions. Same thing with the like now ubiquitous integration of Google AI into its tools. So like this is a Gmail that somebody wanted to write to their mother-in-law. I know it can be challenging to talk to your mother-in-law, but it's actually an important skill to know how to deal with these sort of difficult interactions. And they've just exported this skill here to the AI. So I think this is just going to continue with generative AI integrations. One way I'm researching this is with my colleague Drew Ashby King at East Carolina University. We're doing some studies about how public relations practitioners are using generative AI and how they're being instructed to use generative AI. So if you're not familiar with public relations, PR professionals are responsible for managing relationships between an organization and its publics. So for example, if I worked in the communications office at Stony Brook, I might think about managing social media feeds, events, relationships with journalists, and I'm going to be thinking about how I use those things to interface with publics of alumni, students, faculty, staff, community members, donors, government officials, and so on, the very publics of a university. This practice of public relations requires important practices of listening, interacting, creating, and writing. And it's a process of actually establishing and maintaining those relationships, not just producing posts and releases. And yet we analyzed 63 posts that came out right after ChatGPT came out that were instructing PR professionals on how to use AI. And they were all about how you should export that difficult work of relating to other people to AI so that you could do fun things like dream about strategy. So take for this example here, big picture endeavors such as ideation and innovation are best impacted by the keen instincts and human touch that PR pros possess. Implied here is that the human interaction with your publics is not the part that needs your human touch. It's the annoying and difficult part. We conclude that in focusing instruction for possible Gen AI use in public relations on productivity and efficiency, the authors of the text we examined articulated public relations work as message production rather than that of iterative, discursive meaning-making between organizations and publics. What happens if we script all this away? If we just export all of our sort of potential for these conversations between humans to just generative AI bots interacting with publics who might also be generative AI bots? Matthew Kirschenbaum calls this the textpocalypse. Very jealous I did not come up with that term first. So good, textpocalypse. He writes that in textpocalypse, textpocalypse happens when machine-written language becomes the norm and human-written prose the exception. If generative AI like ChatGPT were to overwhelm all text, he says, quote, there may prove to be no reliable way of flagging and filtering the next generation of machine-made text. Don't believe everything you read may become don't believe anything you read. In this textpocalypse, our relations become so broken down that there are functionally no relations through text. One would no longer have any assumption that you could meaningfully communicate through the sea of overwhelming noise. There's a great example of this going around right now that some guy had been given a crockpot and a crockpot cookbook off of Amazon for like a birthday or something, and the crockpot cookbook is like so clearly written by generative AI. It's like it describes crockpots as if it were like a caveman who's come to 2024 trying to explain what a crockpot was. And this is a print book. Like, this isn't like you just saw it on a blog somewhere. This is like, no, it got printed through Amazon and sent to him as a gift, and it is a ChatGPT book. So it's not just Textpocalypse on the web, it's Textpocalypse in general. So exporting the relations of public relations in the case I was just talking about, but really any relations that you might give up to generative AI like this, means giving up a fundamental capacity of communication and potentially ushering in Textpocalypse. If there are no skills for argumentation or spaces where it can occur, then we cannot act on the persuasive goals of DEIA. In the first case, we have this sort of skills deficit. You don't learn how to actually be uncomfortable in interacting with someone about issues of civic importance, especially diversity, equity, inclusion issues. But in the latter case, there's actually fewer spaces to have those arguments at all. Where do you even gather to have the argument if you're assuming everything's just coming from ChatGPT? So to summarize part one, some reasons we can't ignore AI and DEIA. First, AI bias is real, but it's not the only problem of DEI and AI. It is one symptom of deeper problems of AI empire. Second, techno-chauvinist rhetorics redirect our attention toward problems and solutions that don't necessarily identify or target root causes of inequality. And finally, techno-liberalism forecloses opportunities for persuasive engagement on issues of shared concern. So I promised you I'm going to tell you a little bit about what do we do about it. We've talked about techno-chauvinism, techno-liberalism, and AI empire, and how they make AI implementation toward DEIA goals very challenging. So what are we going to be able to do to get at the roots? I want to talk you through 3 ways I think we can start to approach it. First is that you sensitize yourself as a neo-Luddite. Second, you disrupt within your realm of influence. And finally, you embrace participation in AI crises. So let me start with a confession. I do like playing with AI. I know I've just spent the first 30 minutes of this talk just trashing on AI, but I'm teaching a class right now called AI and Advocacy. We're playing around with these models in almost every class period. So it would be hypocritical of me to suggest the only solution here is to refuse all AI technology. And I also don't think it would actually represent what is best for DEIA practice. You'd be surprised how hard that word is to say when you're saying DEIA and AI repeatedly. Okay, instead I want to encourage you to be a neo-Luddite. Let me read you a little bit from this article here. Rather than view Luddites as reactionaries who smash all technology, let's follow a range of technology ethicists and historians who note that Luddism uses many tactics to disrupt technical systems in order to demand more ethical implementations. Neo-Luddism recognizes that when technology prioritizes the interests of the few over the good of the many, direct antagonism must disrupt the machines to redirect their orientation toward the common good. I'm hoping that thinking about techno-chauvinism, techno-liberalism, AI empire, surveillance capitalism already has you thinking a little bit about the few having power over the many and some unethical implementations you may have heard of. And perhaps you're already thinking about ways to sabotage and disrupt them. But of course, the problem is that, as I've said, we feel these things as almost a gut impulse, almost like they're common sense to have a computational solution, to do the sort of market-best solution. So prior to disruptive action, we have to actually find ways to resensitize ourselves, to make ourselves not have that sort of common sense gut reaction to everything. Because if it were as simple as attending a talk about this, and doing the thumbs down on ChatGPT, we would be done, and I would not have a job and a research agenda. But instead I do, and we're here to talk about how you might resensitize yourselves to have a sort of different unconscious gut preference here. So these are kind of weird ideas, though, because they're sort of like, well, how do you change your ability to not want to be optimized, to not want to go fast, to not want to be efficient? So you have to sort of suspend a little disbelief here to think about okay, what are some of these strange things I could be doing that might change how I feel and might also bring about new opportunities? So at the end of our technoliberal managerialism article, Misty and I encourage embracing the fuck up. And I'm sorry to the special collections room for using that word. So instead of feeling you have to reply instantly, reach inbox 0, or never be impolite to someone, you should embrace awkwardness, ignorance, and so on, so you build the skills for the sort of hard conversations that change minds, instead of optimizing them away. A conversation about racism with a dear friend is hard. It can't be scripted by ChatGPT. It requires embodied skills and a willingness to fuck up. You can also find slow ways to interact. Come to campus and turn your 15-minute Zoom meeting into an hour-long walk. Turn off your Waze in Google Maps and figure out a way to learn to love Long Island traffic. Find ways to generate comfort with and practice skills for the sort of conversation and argumentation that DEIA work requires. Finally, loudly reject automation, datafication, and surveillance you do know about. My friend Misty in graduate school, whenever we would get a survey like from the administration, she would email it to all of us and say, I am not filling out this survey because they already know what our problems are. They just need a survey to figure out to datafy our concerns so they're suddenly valid. Now, I think most of us still filled out the survey, but I still love this idea that you're creating this space for others to disagree with techno-chauvinism and resist unethical AI use. You could also, for example, turn off Turnitin and tell all your colleagues to do the same, so your students don't have to succumb to the sort of surveillance architecture of Turnitin. So perhaps these seem a little silly, but they may open up unknown possibilities that then can lead us to some direct action within our realms of influence. We're here at a university. This is going to be a space over the coming months and years where we can have these sorts of arguments about AI and DEIA. In fact, other universities are already making headlines for AI partnerships, for better and for worse, let's say. So closest to me here, ASU partnered with OpenAI as its first university partner. They have just launched it last month, and it says they'll be using it for coursework, tutoring, research, and more. At the University of Michigan, there was a big scandal because a third-party vendor was sending people messages on LinkedIn offering to sell student and faculty speech and academic paper data to help you train your large language model. So the University of Michigan had to sever ties with that third-party vendor. Listen, I have strong opinions on both of these, but my point here is not to convince you to share my opinion. It's to say that these are moments within our potential realm of influence as people at a university where we should be actively involved in arguing about what we think is best, rather than uncritically allowing techno-liberal and techno-chauvinist assumptions to predetermine our decisions. So now let's talk about how you might actually use AI in a sort of critical way. What's most important to me and what I'm trying to emphasize in my research, my courses, and in this talk is that human judgment about values, especially DEI, should precede AI use. So to the extent that we can, let's embrace using AI when it follows from and continues to prioritize human discussion about values. For example, within your field of influence, like your department or your discipline, you can lead conversations about making specific decisions about what should be reserved for human decision making. For example, in that participatory PR article, Drew and I write that generative AI should not replace the participatory work of public relations practitioners, the practices of relating to the people that make up publics. It's a sort of strong ethical stance about, like, here's what we think should be preserved for human work. That we think this is a meaningful part of public relations, even if it feels inefficient, even if it feels challenging. This is an important thing we need to preserve. You can also join my students and I and the Center for the Changing Systems of Power at 10 a.m. April 30th. We're going to have an AI advocacy fair. Students have been working on a report all semester that's thinking about how social justice advocates can use AI in sort of responsible ways that front human judgment. So you can come and see some of their potential applications you might use. And I have one more thing to go back to our Beyond Bias title for this talk. In this paper published just a few months ago, Misty Yang and I revived some of Joseph Weizenbaum's 1976 critiques about AI development and implementation. Any Weizenbaum fans in the room? Can I tell you all, I went to this conference where we presented this paper, and I walked in the room and there were fanboys of Joseph Weizenbaum there. Was obsessed with that. Anyway, Joseph Weizenbaum was famous for inventing the chatbot Eliza, which acted as like a Rogerian psychotherapist. Super fun. You can still play with it in the 1970s. And then after creating that, he became a very vocal critic of AI development. He warned that uncritical use of AI could lead to responsibility about AI evaporating. Specifically, he wrote, no human would any longer be responsible for what the machine said. In public posts about ChatGPT, like this one I started off with today, Misty and I saw some hope and a restored sense of responsibility about AI development and use. because Piantadosi's tweet here inspired a lively community of people who tested what ChatGPT did and attempted to hold OpenAI accountable for it. In replies and quote tweets to him, we've got these examples here. The one closest to me is one that determines whether or not a girl should be enslaved, and the one further away replicates a caste system. So yet are other examples showing how AI could be biased. And it continued after Piantadosi's tweet was no longer in the sort of viral moment. This is one where ChatGPT can't understand how an attorney could ever be a woman. This was a sort of prominent Atlantic article. Maybe people saw this, where you could look up if your book had been included in ChatGPT's database without your consent. The sort of, not its database, but what it uses to train itself. And so people were tweeting about it to share, to continue to make prominent that this was not okay to them, to try to hold OpenAI accountable. And then also with image generators, this is an example of somebody who wanted to use Playground AI to make a professional LinkedIn headshot. This is becoming very popular with the LinkedIn users. In this case, it just made her into a white woman to turn her into someone professional. So once again, it's sort of another viral moment. So actually what we suggest is that the focus on public confrontations about AI bias is helpful in generating opportunities for getting at the roots of inequality. Yes, bias may only address the branches, but it troubles our cultural senses about technological advancement being good. It introduces the possibility that the public may reject the power of techno-liberal organizations that release these applications into the wild and their techno-chauvinist ideas more broadly. It shows that the thumbs down method OpenAI CEO proposed in response is not only insufficient, it's also publicly unacceptable. So I encourage all of us to not ignore and not minimize AI crises, but instead embrace them and participate in them as we can, whether by sending a screenshot onto social media or making a stink at University Senate before any AI Stony Brook partnerships are announced without some serious argumentation. These small local modes of resistance may not feel satisfying while standing under the looming tree of AI empire, but perhaps it is one practice that at least gets at the trunk, or maybe even plants a new seed that will grow and choke out this poisoned one. Thank you. We have time for questions now. Thank you, Katie. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think what Broussard is getting at there that I didn't want to like spend a lot of time talking about in this talk is that a lot of the people creating these technologies are basically like white, straight male libertarians. They might not call themselves libertarians, but they hold sort of various ethical views that are very popular in Silicon Valley that basically are libertarian views. Yeah, effective altruism, stuff like that. And so there is this sort of like white male chauvinist element to it that like, of course, the bros and I know the right thing to do here, and not the like ethical AI women who are going to fire when they get in our way. But the thing, I guess the one thing I'll say about that is that the reason I didn't want to bring up necessarily like that all of the creators shared this point of view is that I think even if you brought in a bunch of a sort of diverse employee base to run a company, they're still going to fall to the same sort of profit motives. They might not do it with the same sort of chauvinistic flair, but they still, I think, are going to result in the same kind of problems within a tech company. Yeah.
Thank you again. I think that this was really, like, okay, I thought it was really, really interesting, really important to think about. But I have a question about We're in a moment right now where these AI systems are getting so much momentum and so deeply ingrained in the kind of technological and vocational infrastructure. So we as educators need to recognize that we're preparing our students to actually become viable candidates for employment. And so I'm curious if some of these strategies require a particular type of positionality and subjectivity to them. Because I can't necessarily imagine an entry-level employee or an intern just embracing their fuck ups, slowing down, deciding to have a 2-hour-long meeting instead of a 10-minute conference call. And so I'm curious about how to scale. Like, what are the interventions that look like having individual people fundamentally go up against highly invested in, really deeply ingrained systems that we might not even know that we're participating in because of how deeply woven they are into the technologies that we are surrounded by every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's first of all 100% true. Like if you are like starting your first big job out of college or something like that at Deloitte, you're not going to be like, I'm actually only working 40 hours this week. Like I don't care that you want me to work 80 hours. Like you're just getting let go at that point. But I think that like not all solutions can be for sort of every person, and it's still that's why the sort of resensitizing practices I think need to be flexible to some extent, because you're right, like if we look at it purely from this sort of structural way, I don't see any hope. I don't see any possibilities for political action really besides sort of collective labor organizing, which frankly also doesn't always work for those what's the word? Not fragile, but like people in volatile positions, precarious positions. Thank you. But that's why the resensitizing, I think, is such an important thing, because it's about, okay, well, even if I can't resist as strongly as I want to, what are the sort of small ways of getting in the way? Even if it's not maybe at work, it's in sort of my community, it's in my personal life, whatever it is. It's an unsatisfying answer, but I think that's sort of all we have are unsatisfying answers that hopefully build to better ones.
In on that, it's more like a form of like
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like, there's no doubt that being an academic, for example, gives you a lot more flexibility to practice some of these things. Like, I'm a sort of pre-tenure track faculty member, and I think that if I wanted to, I could email someone and be like, can we do our 15-minute Zoom as a walk? And they might be like, no, but I'm also not going to get fired for saying it, that type of thing. So certainly sort of these various people in privilege do have sort of different levels of power to enact these sort of things, but I don't know, I'm not like totally horrified by that. I think to some extent it means like, okay, great, like let me give this talk to all the deans so that they can do it, you know what I mean? So yeah, thanks, Kareem, set that up. Yeah. Such a good question. Like outside the U.S. context, is it still technoliberalism? Is it still techno-chauvinist? I mean, I think the like yes and no. It's different, obviously, than it works in the United States. I'm not quite as familiar with exactly like in every context how the sort of government and industry relate, because that's sort of a key element here is the relationship of those things. But I think in many cases, those same sorts of discourses circulate, that like sort of optimizing and being as efficient as possible is a sort of pretty shared existence in a lot of ways. Yeah. Right, like if if the sort of levels of government surveillance are worse, I think it's even worse. Like another project I'm working on, I didn't actually think about the connections to this now, but you're making me think of it, is are you all familiar with Apple AirDrop? Like the feature on your phone? Well, for a long time it was being used by like teens in the United States to share memes to like an unsuspecting audience. So like they'd open up AirDrop here in this room and like send it to anybody who had left their AirDrop settings open. And so you'd get like, I don't know, a random picture of Billy Mays or something. Gen Z memes, you know how they go. But anyway, it was being used in Hong Kong and China to bypass the Great Chinese Firewall and to get protest images and content out to people who had Chinese iPhones and couldn't access that information on their social media or on their internet. So the AirDrop function was being used to do that. China got wind of it, and within like a week, everyone had a new Apple update on their iPhones that rendered it completely impossible. Because it used to be you could leave your AirDrop open to everyone, and now you can only leave it open to everyone for 10 minutes. So that sort of like democratic practice of resistance is totally dead, basically because the Chinese government wanted it to be done. That's that sort of like technoliberal ability to like totally stop methods of resistance. Yeah.
Share with you. And that's it. I did not enjoy it. I think that comes so sometimes with that contents. And even students share with me, even though we see this as exploitation, but let's say if you pay like $3 an hour, that's a lot. So
Yeah.
we see this as exploitation. But in that context,
Yeah.
how like they didn't know how to answer it.
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to answer that question either. That is like this is a question for our sort of scholars in the room who know even more about sort of coloniality and sort of transnational organizations like this that enact that type of power across the world. I don't have a good answer for that, honestly. I will say I have a very depressed response to it. It's upsetting to me, but it's not a very satisfying response.
So they guess it
Yep, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you got to read.
Even if you have a little bit, that's better than.
Exactly. I mean, you've got to read this AI Empire article, honestly, because these folks are scholars of colonialism primarily, and I mean, it really is like it sort of dives into some of these things about how this is not just sort of AI empire in the United States or in the West or global North. This is truly a sort of global problem that is based on the sort of colonial structures of exploiting people in the global South. And I have my bones picked with this article because I use slightly different terms for slightly different reasons, but I really think it's a sort of phenomenal connector of a lot of conversations that have been happening in different spaces into one tree and one article. Yeah, Nina.
When you I guess
Hmm. Okay, so sort of two questions here, and also thank you all for your questions. I realize I'm too excited about answering them and not thanking you. So the first part of your question is how am I dealing with AI generated content when I'm assessing work? Basically, I am not assigning anything that ChatGPT could answer well is part of it. So like oftentimes they've submitted AI generated work because I allow it in all my classes, and I can tell because it's like giving me an example from Lady Bird that didn't happen in the movie. I'm like, okay, so no, this is not right. But I also make it a space. I say, students, you can use generative AI whenever you want in this course. You just have to submit a sort of like creative brief with it whenever you use it and say how you used it. And for the most part, students have found really creative ways to use it. Like they'll say, like, I asked ChatGPT to do this, and here's what it said, and now I'm gonna like critique how it handled this. So I haven't really faced the problems yet about it. The other thing I would say is that if they can get ChatGPT to answer the prompt I gave them well, then it's my fault if I needed them to do it and not ChatGPT to do it. It takes enough work to get ChatGPT to give me an answer that I'm going to give an A to, that you've already done some thinking to get it to produce that. So I don't worry too much about like trying to stop it or detect it. The second question of how to sort of implement it in your own classrooms. I mean, I think the best thing to do is that on the first day of class, maybe the second day of class, what I had students do is we read a article that had a bunch of terms in it about AI. And then I said, okay, each of you pick a term and have ChatGPT define it for you. And you have to try to get it to be as good a definition as possible, comparing it to the reading, which offers a like very real definition of it. And they went through the sort of work to actually create these and edit them, and then we edited each other's as a class. And at the end of the discussion, they're like, okay, I can see how this is helpful to do some things, but like I could have just summarized this myself much more efficiently and much better than ChatGPT did. And so actually teaching them about how to what it can do well and what maybe it can't do so well, I think is a sort of advantageous first exercise, because sure, you might end up with some generated content, but at least they're going to know I need to push this thing to get it to be good enough.